Alright, today we're going to do Pythagorean Theorem, which you guys haven't had the Pythagorean Theorem as far as back in algebra. And not only are we going to use the Pythagorean Theorem to prove whether we have right triangles, which also can be used to find a missing side of a right triangle. And it can also be used to determine if the triangle is a right triangle, an obtuse triangle, or a acute triangle. All right, first let's go ahead and talk about what the Pythagorean Theorem does. Right here, the very first, they start with some notes for you, and it says it describes the relationship between the side lengths of a right triangle. And you guys are familiar that if triangle ABC is a right triangle with right angle C, then A squared plus B squared equals C squared. In other words, if you have a right triangle, then it doesn't matter. Okay, for instance, here is A, B, and C, and they said they wanted C to be the right triangle. Well, you know, our two sides that make the right angle, which would be AC that I'm shading in red and BC that I'm shading in red, well, those would be my legs. Those are my two legs. And so what does that make this side here that I'm drawing the blue arrow? That's right, that is the hypotenuse. Okay, and isn't it always the longest side? Yes, the hypotenuse is always the longest side. Okay, well, when you talk about the Pythagorean Theorem, okay, and I'm going to draw another triangle up here because that's kind of getting muddled up. I'm going to draw the same right triangle, and I have A, and there's C, and there's B. Well, to use the Pythagorean Theorem, the A squared plus B squared equals C squared, well, I need you to remember that your legs, which this is one of my legs, is A, and the other leg is B. Now, does it matter which one we label as A and B? No, it doesn't. Right now, one leg is A and the other leg is B. It doesn't matter which one, but one leg is A and the other leg is B. Your hypotenuse is always your C. Okay? So, if we're trying to find a missing part, it just depends. Is it a leg? Is it a hypotenuse? The next thing I want to talk about is what's called a Pythagorean Triple. And kind of move this screen a little bit. And if they say that you have a Pythagorean triple, that means that the three side lengths that you have fit the Pythagorean Theorem. In other words, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. For instance, let's go ahead and do this one right here since it's easy numbers. Well, 3, 4, and 5. Well, since 5 is the longest side, doesn't 5 have to be the hypotenuse? Right, because the hypotenuse is always the longest side. So it would be my C, so that means 3 and 4 are my B. So, or my 3 and 4 are my A and B. So 3 squared plus 4 squared would have to equal 5 squared if this is going to be a right triangle. Well, what is 3 squared? That's 9. What is 4 squared? That's 16. And what is 5 squared? That's 25. Now, if you add 9 and 16 together, what do you get? That's right, you get 25. So we have 25 equaling 25. In other words, the hypotenuse squared, this stuff on the right side, is equal to the sum of the legs squared. And since both sides equal, it's a right triangle. So these three sides here, 3, 4, and 5, they are a Pythagorean triple. And they give a bunch of other different types of Pythagorean triples. So all these numbers listed here and all these columns are types of triangles that would make a right triangle because the two legs squared and added equal the hypotenuse squared. So, using Pythagorean Theorem. Well, what we're going to do in this section is we're going to go ahead and see if what we have makes a right triangle. Well, these two parts right here, 81 and 108, those are my legs. How do I know they're legs? Well, look, aren't they the two sides that are making the right angle? So I have 81 squared plus 108 squared. And that would equal my hypotenuse. Now they had x there. I could put x and square it, or it's my c. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and stay constant, but x here. X squared. Well, get my handy dandy calculator out. 81 squared means I'm going 81 times 81, which is 6,561, plus 108 squared, which is 11,664. And that still equals that missing hypotenuse squared, or x squared. Alright, so I would add those two totals, 6,561 plus that 11,664, and I would get 18,225. Now, it still equals x squared. Well, I'm trying to find what x is. Well, how do I get x by itself? Well, what's being done? Well, x is being squared, right? Well, how do you undo squaring? The way that you undo squaring is by taking the square root. And whatever I do on one side, I do on the other. So when I take the square root of x squared, I'm left with x, which that's what I want. And then when I go to my handy-dandy calculator and go the square root of 18,225, I get 135. And so the two legs squared added together equals the hypotenuse squared. And so, yes, it is a right triangle, or it is a triple, that Pythagorean triple. I'm not going to write the Pythagorean triple, but it is that right there that I'm circling in blue. Well, if I did the same thing for number 2, well, x and 4 are my legs, right? So I have x squared plus 4 squared equals 8 squared. Well, 8's my hypotenuse. That's still x squared. 4 squared is 16, and 8 squared is 64. Now, this is a little different, because now I need to get x by itself. Well, I would subtract 16. Alright, and so now I have x squared equal, let's see, 64 minus 16 is 48. I need to get x by itself, so I would take the square root. And so I have x equals the square root of 48, depending on if they want it in simplest terms. If they wanted it in simplest terms, which you guys did in the last lesson, would be 4 radical 3. Or for right now, let's just go ahead and calculate that and round to the nearest tenth. You would get 6.9. And so, yes, it is a right triangle. It does give me a right triangle. Okay. Okay. So we're on the second page now. So we've got this word problem. It says, from school you biked 1.2 miles due south and then 0.5 miles due east to your house. If you had biked from home on the street that runs directly diagonal from your house from school to your house, how many fewer miles would you have biked? Well, first of all, let's give ourselves a little compass. And remember, if you have your directions, you know, that would be north, that would be east, that would be south, and that over here would be west. Well, let's make yourself a triangle, because that's in essence what we made. I'm starting right here at school. I'll put S for school. And so you go this direction, okay, and you head south. Okay, you head south. And then after you go 1.2 miles, you go straight east. Well, when I go this direction, when I go south and then directly go east, don't I make a perpendicular line? Okay, so there's making a right angle. So there's my right angle. And right here at this point, that's my home. So we'll put H for home. And so they say that distance is 0.5 miles. Well, think about that. If I take that and go straight south 1.2 miles and straight east 0.5 miles, well, 1.2 plus 0.5, my decimals didn't show up very good, did they? That would be a total distance of 1.7 miles. Okay? That would be 1.7 miles if I go the two different directions. What they're wanting to know is if you left the school and went diagonally, the blue line that I'm drawing here to home, would it be shorter? Okay, so what is that distance? So they're wanting us to find this distance. Well, isn't that the hypotenuse? So that's what we're going to find. All right, so the 1.2 and the 0.5, those are my legs. So 1.2 squared plus 0.5 squared equals my hypotenuse, or x squared. Well, 1.2 squared is 1.44, that's a point, and 0.5 squared is 0.25. Well, so add my two totals together, and 1.44 plus 0.25 is 1 1.69. Okay, well, so I need to get x squared by itself. So how do we get x squared by itself? That's right, we take the square root. And so x squared, I've got to come over here. The square root of x squared is x, and the square root of 1.69 is 1.3. So what we just found is that this distance is 1.3. But we're really not done with the problem, because they asked how many fewer miles is it if we go that way. Well, I know what the total distance was originally right here, 1.7, if I go south and then I go east. But if I just go diagonally, is this distance. Well, how can I figure out what do I need to do to find out how fewer? Take the 1.7 minus the 1.3, and you would get, it would be 0.4 of a mile, or 0.4 miles. And so 0.4 is the answer. So what I want you to do is I want you to do 4 and 5. They want to know if it's a right triangle or not. Well, remember, for it to be a right triangle, my two legs, have to go the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, the longest side, remember, is going to be your hypotenuse. And I'm going to give you a hint. That and that are those two triangles that I just circled. Those are your hypotenuses, or your C. So go ahead and do those. You can round if your answer isn't a perfect radical when you put it in the calculator, round it to the nearest tenth. When you think you have an answer, raise your hand and the sub can come by and see if you got it right. Or if you're stuck, the sub also can help you out and see what's wrong. Okay, so do 4 and 5 on your own, and then after you get checked out by the substitute teacher, then continue on with the notes. Alright, so the last thing here we talked about is being able to classify triangles. And everything we just did so far is that if a squared plus b squared is equal to the hypotenuse squared, if the two sides are equal, then we know it makes a right triangle. But what if it doesn't equal? In other words, look right here for it to be a acute triangle. This one right here with the black arrow that I'm trying to draw, it's not working out so well. But when you took the a squared plus b squared, the two legs here, their total was bigger than the hypotenuse squared. Well, anytime the two legs squared and added are bigger than the hypotenuse, then you have an acute triangle. Or if your hypotenuse squared is bigger than the two legs squared and added together, then it's obtuse. So here we go. They want you to classify these triangles here. Well, they give you these three measures right here on 6 to 7, and so let's figure out which ones are A, B, and C. Well, again, for something to be a right triangle, doesn't the longest measure have to be the hypotenuse? So even though we don't know if this is a right triangle or not, we're going to go ahead and use the Pythagorean theorem. So that means this is the longest side, so that's my C. So that means I have 90 squared plus 216 squared, and we're going to see if it is equal to 234 squared. Okay? So you guys go ahead and do it yourself and see, does this total on this side, when I combine this stuff, square it and add it together, will it equal 234 squared? If they equal each other, then it's a right triangle. If one side is bigger than the other, then it's acute obtuse. Just remember, and I'm going to use colors, if this side is bigger, okay, then that means it's an obtuse triangle. See how I underlined obtuse in blue? But if I add the two legs, supposed legs together, and this side is bigger, the two legs, the A and B, then that means it's an acute triangle. But remember, if the two sides equal, then it's a right triangle. Okay? So do 6 and 7. When you're done, raise your hand and have the sub look at it and see if you got it right. Actually, you know what? I will do number 7. I want you to do number 6. So go ahead and do number 6 first, and then raise your hand, and then the sub will get with you. All right, so I'm going to do number 7. Well, you know, the square root of 3 is your c. Okay, the square root of 3 is bigger than what 1 is. The square root of 3 is like 1.7 or something like that. So it's a bigger value. So I know that's a bigger side. So it would have to be my c. So that means 1 and 1 are my legs. So 1 squared, that's 1 leg, plus the other, what would be the leg, that'd be my b, 1 squared. And we'll see, I don't know if that's going to be squared, if that's going to be equal to the hypotenuse squared. And so now I have the square root of 3 squared. Okay, so what is 1 squared? Well, that's 1. And 1 squared is 1. And the square root of 3 squared would just give me 3. Well, 1 plus 1 is 2. And is 2 equal to 3? No. 2 would be what? Would be less than 3. So isn't my hypotenuse bigger? And so since my hypotenuse is bigger, that means those 3 side measures, 1, 1, and the square root of 3, would give me an obtuse triangle.